Now we're continuing here to look at the post-flood period after the Ice Age, sudden warming up and change or reversal to what we see today. The uniformitarianists, what they see today. It was quick. It wasn't a long-term thing. Mostly favors worldwide flood, single ice age, recent creation. Take a look at where we left off, the volcanic eruptions. UPTIONS. Okay. Now, say another factor, the last time I looked at this, may also have been involved. We have seen the great amount of volcanic activity occur during the flood. Tremendous amounts of volcanic rocks associated with the strata of all geologic systems probably contributed chemically to the formation of extensive carbonate rocks. And although the volcanic eruptions thus may have made a substantial contribution to the post-deluge increment of carbon dioxide in the air, this effect was undoubtedly masked and more than offset by by the fine dust that was discharged into the air by the volcanic systems. This volcanic ash served to reduce the isolation, the amount of solar energy reached the Earth's surface, and in fact the volcanic dust discharged into the air by the intense volcanic activity near the beginning of what the geologists call the Pleistocene era has been one of the main theories as advocated by them as an explanation of the glacial age. It may well have been a contributing factor, although with the removal of the ice canopy by the flood to the initiation of the actual glaciation was the more actual cause. Dr. Wexler, U.S. Weather Bureau, is one of the chief advocates of this theory, estimates that the solar radiation reaching the ground may be reduced by as much as 20% by volcanic dust after a severe eruption. Evidently, these volcanoes were worldwide. However, the volcanic dust would have remained in the air only a few years at most. Speaking of the dust produced by the most prolific volcanic explosion of modern times, Krakatoa in the East Indies, biochemist Asimov says pretty nearly all that dust had settled back to Earth after 2 years. The Krakatoa dust, he says, has caused a definite lowering of temperatures for 2 or 3 years, but had no particular effect after that. The much more extensive volcanic activity of the deluge and post-deluge periods would probably have reduced temperatures for somewhat longer periods, but at best only for a few years. This effect likely contributed to the initiation of the Ice Age, but the greater cause was the loss of the Earth's ice canopy. Temperatures rising quickly, but the carbon dioxide contributed by the volcanoes remained after the dust had settled and remained with the already present and gradually being added by geological and oceanic exchange mechanisms to cause a gradual warming of the temperature of the Earth. One particular biological mechanism may have acted to contribute an enormously large amount of carbon dioxide, namely the development of bogs. These are not the same as the familiar coastal salt marshes, but may form on uplands as well as low areas. The cool, moist conditions of the pro-glacial regions would have been unusually well suited for the development of boglands. The present boglands of the world are of great extent in spite of great areas that have been drained or burned. George Jazikov, Russian peat expert, computes that there are 223 billion dry tons of peat available on the Earth, more than half of it in the USSR. Deavy, in Scientific American, says the significance of large amounts of peat vegetation in fairly close proximity to the ice sheets is that they could have had a material influence on the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the air over the ice sheet and probably over the whole world, all brought about by the worldwide flood. It would have taken some decades or centuries for extensive bogs to develop around the ice, and it is likely that some other factors such as volcanic carbon dioxide increased the atmospheric ozone or carbon dioxide from biological mechanisms in general would have initiated the warming. Looking at all these things that contributed to global warming. But this in turn may have then have begun to oxidize the peat already developed and caused an accelerated warming, which in effect finally brought a relatively sudden termination of the Ice Age. Whatever may have been the detailed processes which initiated and terminated the great glaciations, it seems evident that the Great Flood provides an abundantly adequate ultimate explanation thereof. Certain of the above concepts as to the effect of carbon dioxide on the antediluvian and glacial climates are supported by the studies of Dr. Gilbert Pass, Johns Hopkins, whose work is sponsored by the Office of Naval Research. This is probably the greatest present authority on the subject. He says, for example, there is some interesting evidence which suggests that the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere was much larger than at present. It is known that plants grow more luxuriantly and rapidly in an atmosphere that has from 5 to 10 times the normal carbon dioxide amount. In fact, our carbon dioxide is sometimes released in greenhouses in order to promote growth. Here we're all worried about global warming. Since plants are perfectly adapted to make maximum use of the spectral range and intensity of the light that reaches them from the sun for photosynthesis, it seems strange that they are not better adapted to the present carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere. Simplest explanation of this fact is that the plants evolved at a time when the carbon dioxide concentration was considerably higher than it is today, and that it has been at a higher level during most of the ensuing time. Higher temperatures than today during most of the Earth's history would have resulted in this higher carbon dioxide content. In fact, the geological evidence shows that the warmer climates than today have existed for at least 9/10 of the time since the Cambrian period. In ideal times, it was warmer. We're all worried about global warming. So we can summarize the Ice Age as a unique post-flood short-term event. Recent creation, worldwide flood, single global Ice Age glaciation. Glaciation was only one of the after effects of the deluge, though undoubtedly the most spectacular. Tree rings indicate a recent catastrophic flood in recent Earth. More evidence to conclude a recent creation, worldwide flood, single Ice Age. One valuable natural chronometric device is the common tree and its annual growth rings and their patterns. Both living and dead trees can be used in this science known as dendrochronology. Another big word. Perhaps the most intriguing of the unanswered questions regarding longevity in conifers, which are evergreen trees, has to do with Sequoia gigantea trees, which some believe may enjoy perpetual life in the absence of gross destruction, since they appear immune to pest attack. Does this mean that shortly preceding 3,275 years ago, the age of the oldest conifers, all the then living giant sequoias were wiped out by some catastrophe? Interesting, like the worldwide flood. Schulman, Longevity Under Adversity in Conifers, microscopic study of growth rings reveals that a bristlecone pine tree found last summer at nearly 10,000 feet began growing more than 4,600 years ago, and thus surpasses the oldest known sequoia by many centuries. Many of its neighbors are nearly as old. We have now dated 17 bristlecone pines 4,000 years or more. Wow. He goes on to say, since these, as well as the sequoias and other ancient trees, are still living, it is pertinent to ask why these oldest living things apparently have had time to develop only one generation since they acquired their present stands at some time after the deluge. There is no record of a tree or any other living thing being older than any reasonable date for the deluge. Historical records indicate a recent civilization, not an old, evolved one. In the last analysis, the only really reliable recorder of time is man himself. In any kind of natural process that might be used to determine past time, there is always the possibility that the rates may have changed, as well as uncertainty regarding its initial condition. It is absolutely impossible to know beyond question that such and such a formation or deposit has an age of so many years, unless the age is supported by reliable human records of some kind. And it is, therefore, highly significant that no truly verified archaeological datings antedate the time of about 3000 BC or even later. Larger dates are, of course, frequently ascribed to various localities and cultures, but they are always based on radiocarbon and other geographical methods rather than written human records. There are numerous extant chronologies that have been handed down from the various ancient peoples, and it is bound to be significant that none of them yield acceptable evidence that the histories of these or other peoples antedate the biblical date for the deluge. So in other words, the Bible took the topography of the earth and completely inundated it, pun intended, and destroyed evidence of it and recreated its own rock strata and evidence. You start adding things beyond the worldwide flood, the evidence doesn't exist. The Bible pictures the dispersal of post-Diluvian man from the geographical areas implied also by archaeology and secular history. The most ancient peoples leaving historical records were, of course, the inhabitants of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, the Nile Valley of Egypt, and other Near Eastern areas. This correlates perfectly with the Bible records, which picture the centrifugal movement of tribes out from the first kingdom of Babylon, Babel in Genesis 11:9. It is remarkable how many different lines of evidence of a historical nature point back to a time around 3000 BC as the dating the beginning of true civilization. The worldwide testimony of trustworthy, recorded history is therefore that such history begins about 3000 BC and not substantially earlier. This is indeed surprisingly strange if men actually have been living throughout the world for many tens of thousands of years. But on the other hand, if the biblical records are true, then this is, of course, exactly the historical evidence we would expect to find. And it is pertinent to mention in passing the worldwide incidence of flood legends. It is not at all unreasonable to conclude that the clear reality of the great world deluge, which remade the world in the days of Noah. So, the world's population testifies to a young earth. Ever since the famous studies of Malthus, it has been known that human populations have tended to increase geometrically with time. At the time of the birth of Christ, there presumably were 250 to 350 million people on this planet. Some 700 years later, it was about the same number, say 300 million. A long, slow decline in total population had been followed by compensating increase. It took roughly 950 more years, namely until 1650, for this 300 million to double to 600 million. But then it took only 200 years from 1650 to 1850, and for the next doubling up to 1200 million, or 1.2 billion, from 1850 to 1950. In only 100 years, the Earth's population doubled again to about 2.4 billion. Don't have enough time for adding up growth of human population to only get to what we have today. Has to be a short time. It could not be maintained, Weaver says, of course, that this calculation is completely rigorous, but it is certainly reasonable, far more so than say that the population is then doubling itself since a hypothetical beginning several hundred